Welcome to Dialogue. The U.S. has announced the delay of a planned visit to China by Secretary of State Antony Blinken because of the recent dispute over a Chinese civilian research balloon which accidentally drifted into U.S. airspace. The visit was part of a serious efforts by both sides to get China-U.S. relations back on track. What is the latest about this critically important bilateral relationship? How has it evolved over the past years? And what are the hopes for improvement in the future? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined today by Professor John Gong from the University of International Business and Economics, Benoit Hardy-Chartrand, adjunct professor of political science and international affairs at Temple University in Japan, and Harvey Dzodin, senior fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the discussion, gentlemen. John, I will start with you. Before we touch upon the latest, the delay of the visit and also the balloon accident, give us some background. We know that both countries are currently making efforts to bring their relationship or to stabilize their ties since the summit meeting, at the G20, basically summit in Indonesia. For the two leaders, they agreed bond with each other. We need to stabilize the ties, and it's a responsibility for both countries, for their own interests, and also for the peace and stability for the world. Since then, we are seeing efforts from both sides, right?
Yeah. So following up the summit meeting between President Xi and Biden in Bali, my understanding is that both sides are being a continuous dialogue, and which comes up to this visit by potential visit by Antony Blinken. My guess is that they gotta have achieved some results in following up what the two leaders have reached upon in Bali, but derailed by this incident. Just a few hours, I think, before he was about to actually board the airplane, the White House decided that he's not going to go. Now, there's also an alternative theory saying that they don't expect to see much results coming out of this trip anyway, because this trip will be essentially, I would say, hijacked by this incident. So it will be all over this topic, and there's not much to talk about actually. And I'm guessing that the talk will be turning into a heated exchange, I would say, and also there's also a concern from the White House to answer to the pressure from the GOP side, trying to show that we are tough on China, this kind of a thing. So that's why eventually they decided not to come, which is okay. I think even if he comes, there'll not be much to talk about in my view, right? And it's just going to be pointing fingers at each other and yelling at each other, I would say. So it's better be postponed, actually. Now, also I want to emphasize that even the press in the United States have been mostly talking about cancellation of the trip. It's actually not true at all. The White House official word is postponement. And I think it's also emphasized again yesterday or today by President Biden. So, he's going to come. It's just going to be a matter of time.
Probably at a later time. Harvey, John seems not that optimistic about the visit, about the relationship. What do you make of it?
Well, I think it's a very bad sign that Biden didn't come, that Blinken didn't come. And I think actually that it would have been good if he had come. So I disagree with John in a way, because I think this is a perfect issue to discuss, because it's important to get this behind us and to work on much more important issues that really we can work on together. And we're not doing that. And John had mentioned about the people in the Republican Party. And I believe that that's why the visit had to be postponed, because the people in the Republican Party, a lot of them are crazy extremists. I mean, if you have people like Marjorie Taylor Greene on the House Homeland Security Committee, who once said that California wildfires were started by space lasers financed by Jewish people like the Rothschilds who control the world, talk about space cadets. These are real American leaders? Heaven help us. So I think that we have so much bilateral issues to discuss. And because the visit was postponed, I hope it will happen soon. If it doesn't happen soon, I'm going to be very, very worried.
Mm-hmm. Well, Benoit, if you look at the relationship from, say, a different countries' point of view, in particular the Asian countries, in general, I would say Asian countries would love to see a stabilized relationship between the two largest economies and probably two most powerful countries. I mean, if things get worse, they say, we just can't afford to have the relationship to continue probably to fall. So what do you make of the efforts over the past, let's say, couple of months, and also, until this point, it's like another testing point for both countries?
No, absolutely. I think, as John pointed out at the beginning of the show, it was notable to see that since November, since President Xi and President Biden met in Bali, there had been real efforts at stabilizing the relationship. Both sides have been talking about installing or setting up guardrails to prevent the relationship from really free falling into conflict. So I think a lot of people were somewhat reassured by looking at what had transpired since last November. Both sides obviously want to avoid conflict. We had seen over the last few months a slightly milder tone in both Washington as well as Beijing. Just recently, Blinken was talking to the new foreign minister, Gong of China. So you could see real efforts on both sides to make sure that this does not escalate to a level where that would be very difficult to manage. So that's very positive. But obviously, looking at it from the regional perspective, which is your question, if you think of Japan, for example, where I'm located, there are still concerns over the direction of the relationship, because even though on the surface over the last few months things had been going a little more smoothly, the fundamental issues, the fundamental differences, the divergences in terms of the worldview, in terms of the strategic goals, objectives of the United States and China, well, this has not really changed. So I think we can expect these divergences to continue in the future. But at least for the region, for stability, let's just hope that there is a continued willingness on both sides in terms of keeping things under control and maintaining dialogue open.
Mm-hmm. Well, John, if you look at the logistics, basically preparation by both sides for the upcoming visit, that's the first, that would be the first by U.S. Secretary of State in 5 years. And also on the Chinese side, President Xi Jinping was planned to meet the senior U.S. official. That would be like in probably 8 or even longer period of time for the first time for the Chinese leader to meet Secretary of State from the U.S. So it's important. Obviously, importance was given from both sides. Of course, for the Republicans, the talking points is like, oh, there are too many empty talks. It's not going to work, and it doesn't work. But look, at this critical point of time, because of the balloon, there's both sides disagree with each other. But isn't it just a case in point that they need to talk to each other? Communication is critical for both sides to reduce misunderstanding or to increase their understanding of each other to avoid any potential problems.
Qingduo, the problem is that there are these politicians in Congress who are thinking from a partisan politics perspective. In other words, the China-American relationship is not really high on their agenda. I mean, they're really trying to take a stab at Democrats and trying to take this opportunity to make a point that to gain some political points, essentially. I can't imagine that senators like Tom Cotton, for example, who have served in the United States Marine Corps, he fully understands that this balloon incident poses not any military or defense threat to the United States. The capabilities displayed, even if it's some cameras on it, even if the Washington's version is correct, even if there are these cameras on this balloon, it poses no more, surveillance capability than the satellites already being, up in the sky over the United States. So they understand fully well that this has really, really little marginal impact on the current status at all. But they still take the issue and make a big deal out of this. I mean, essentially, to sensationalize this event, to essentially talk to the American people and say, look, the Chinese are coming, they're over our head, they're watching us 24/7. This kind of a stupid narratives. They fully understand this is total nonsense, but they're still talking about these things. And clearly, the objective and the perspective is all about American domestic politics.
Well, politics, keeping that in mind, and we are seeing from the recent remarks either by the spokesperson from State Department or the White House and the president himself, President Biden's side, was meeting the media. He said that basically this accident, the balloon thing, will not weaken our relationship with China. So Harvey, that's basically a sign of relief, and the relationship will probably still on track?
I hope so, but I'm not sure. Because the Republicans, as John had said, are making great political hay about this. The problem is that we all know that intelligence operations have been going on basically since there have been human beings. And we know that both sides, that many countries have sophisticated intelligence, and they mostly use satellites and things that are unseen by the public. But the problem with this balloon was that people could actually see it, and that's why it became a thing. And Republicans are hell-bent on making it an issue. And unfortunately, the only thing that Republicans and Democrats can agree about these days is China bashing. I don't think that's good for the world. I don't think it's good for either country. And so the sooner we get back to basics and start working on the issues that we can work on together, the better. But I think the Republicans are going to milk this for all it's worth. And, the Republicans have set up a committee to investigate China and American-Chinese relations and so on. They're just going to have a field day. And I can't but hope that sooner rather than later that we're going to get off of this, that Blinken's going to come and that we can get back to discussing important issues like climate change and global public health and so on, because that's what we really need to be concentrating on, because if we don't, we're not going to be here in a generation or two.
Mm-hmm. Yes, valid points there. Benoit, of course, it's really about the impact of this balloon thing, whether it's a short-lived, effects, or it's going to have a long-term impact on the relationship. So can we get it over soon, in the probably near future? So forget about the balloon. Probably we should talk about something more important.
I mean, honestly, I agree to some extent with the other guest. I think the balloon incident, yes, it has been slightly blown out of proportion. And yes, it's absolutely true that there are some elected officials in the United States that are trying to score easy political points given this incident. But in the grand scheme of things, this is a relatively small blip on the radar. I think what we've seen over the last couple of days, it was bound to have some short-term repercussions, and we are seeing this right now with the postponement of the Blinken trip to Asia. That would have been very difficult under the current circumstances for Blinken, given all the political pressure. It would have been difficult for him to go ahead with the trip. That would have made the Democratic Party an easy target from the other side, obviously. But given the much greater issues, and given the fact that obviously both sides are continuously spying on each other, just as are other countries in the world, both sides understand that there's no point to really dwell too much on this. So when the temperature kind of lowers over the next couple of weeks, I have no doubt, or at least I'm cautiously optimistic that the bilateral relationship are going to go back to where they were prior to this incident. Now, of course, before the incident, it's not that the relationship was going that well, but as I had said earlier, it was certainly on the way to becoming more stabilized. So for those reasons, because of the fact that there are much greater problems, I am of the belief that this will not have too great an impact on anything more than the short term.
Well, John, of course, we talked about the efforts by the two sides trying to stabilize the relationship. But of course, there was something probably different, something not highly appreciated by the Chinese side. Let's say that. For example, U.S. has been working recently together with Japan and the Netherlands, basically to impose export control, probably a sweeping control of the tools or any kind of machines used to produce advanced chips in China. And also, basically, now we are talking about, or it's reported in the media that the U.S. is going to cutting the links, basically banning U.S. suppliers to provide any components to Huawei, for example. Is the U.S. continuing the decoupling, let's say, in the high-tech sector? What kind of impact they will have probably on, high-tech sector decoupled, what about the other part of the relationship?
Yeah, let me first disagree with what Benoit just said. Just give me a minute. I think this incident's influence over the long run is just profound because it's such a vivid image enshrined in American people's mind for many, many years to come. This picture of this big white ball up in the sky, that's a Chinese ball, it's watching over us. And I think it's a huge blow to the American psyche. The Diplomat magazine ran an article which is titled, finally there's a Spoonish moment, in terms of China's
moment. Okay.
Yeah, I call it balloon moment. Okay, so I think it's going to be psychologically and also socially speaking, it's going to be a huge impact. And I think now the consensus over China being a threat is not just among politicians in Washington. It's going to be much broader across the U.S. spectrum. I mean, the political spectrum, and even among the average American people out there. So it's just going to be very, very bad. I mean, China is essentially being vilified, being demonized, and I think the impact is going to be very long term. Now, back to your question about the decoupling issue. In terms of the impact, I think it's very clear what the United States has been doing right now is very much similar to what it was being done to for the most part of the 19th century, when the British government imposed more or less the same decoupling or sanctions against the United States at the time with respect to the textile technologies. But today, of course, it's much broader, and it's semiconductor industry. But what I'm referring to this part of history to illustrate a point that the outcome of these sanctions, the outcome of these technology restrictions is just futile. If you look at the history, the United States succeeded beyond the widest dream that it has developed its own technologies in textile industries, regardless of what the British government has done. So I think in the short run, China is going to take a beating. There will be short supply of these high-end semiconductor chips, but I think over the long run, it serves as an impetus for Chinese companies to develop its own indigenous technologies. It's going to take some time, by the way, but I think eventually, it's just a small supply shock in the grand scheme of things over many decades. So I think United States government is going to come back and sooner or later to realize that this policy is not going to work. It's not going to work over the long run.
Beyond the technology, probably into the military and also the Asia-Pacific region, for example, according to Japanese media, Washington has recently proposed deploying medium-range missiles in Japan. And of course, the U.S. has reached, basically, will have a full new military bases, Harvey, in the Philippines. So it's either targeting the South China Sea issue or the Taiwan issue there. So then, of course, the U.S., one U.S. four-star Air Force general talked about the military scenario in 2025. But I think the latest by official from the Pentagon saying that, we are not seeing any signs of China taking military action over Taiwan. So all those remarks, all those talks, and also the actions over there, Harvey, what do you make of it? Are we preparing for a war between the two most powerful countries?
It certainly, in a way, looks like that. Xinhua, we may or may not be. I think what we're looking at is a continuing of this confrontation And I'm worried about that for several reasons. I think this might empower the more militaristic right-wing elements in Japan, and you know where that led in the 1930s and 40s. There's a good sign, I guess, on the other side that Japan and China are going to have a functioning crisis hotline quite soon. That's positive because it'll eliminate the chance of some kind of accidental confrontation. And in the Philippines, it's putting American personnel closer to China, the South China Sea, and so on. So it sets up a real situation where we could have more conflict. So I'm very worried about that. It seems to continue the Trump playbook and the Biden playbook by trying to encircle China both economically and politically. And of course, throughout Chinese history, from ancient times, the thing that China has tried to protect itself from is being encircled. And the Americans are trying their hardest and succeeding to some degree by cowing our allies to fall in line and doing just that. And I think it's an ominous sign for the future. And because the Union of Atomic Scientists 2 weeks ago reset the atomic, their clock, their doomsday clock, to 90 seconds to Armageddon, the closest it's ever been, it's because of actions like this. And it's because of this that people like me who are optimists are no longer so optimistic.
All right, no longer optimistic there. Benoit, of course, I mean, for people probably in the U.S., of course, there's consensus. China is the greatest challenge for us. We need to take on China. But look, if people put their foot in the Chinese shoes to think about it, if China having a new military bases, for example, in Cuba or somewhere close to the U.S., what will the U.S. respond? I mean, people naturally feel pressured, if not threatened. And of course, it will have an impact regionally, right?
No, of course. And I think that's one of the issues when it comes to the, both sides to some extent, is the lack of empathy and the lack of understanding of the other side's point of view. And I really think that goes both ways, actually. But in the case of the United States, yes, of course. And you look at there's a degree of hypocrisy in some of their foreign policy, some of the things that they will, some of the values that they will advance when it comes to advancing or promoting democracy abroad, for example, while at the same time maintaining relationships with countries that do not respect these same values. Of course, there's a degree of hypocrisy there once again. But yes, when it comes to this, the issue of bases and also Harvey was mentioning that during his previous response when it comes to the bases that are around China, when it comes to the pressure that is posed on China from the American side. Of course, there's a lack of a certain degree of empathy when it comes to that, and that leads to a lot of the misguided policies that I believe we see really on both sides. Because we have to admit that also on the Chinese side, there are many instances of a lack of understanding of the reasons why the United States pursue some of their policies in the region. So I really think this is one of the reasons, by the way, why bilateral dialogue, while maintaining communication despite headwinds, despite obstacles, remains important in order to ensure a greater mutual understanding and empathy.
Mm-hmm. Understanding is important. Of course, sometimes you do see issues or cases where it's very hard for them to understand each other. One of that would be John, the U.S. House Speaker, for example, the new House Speaker, actually, Kevin McCarthy. He's new. He's reportedly planning a visit to Taiwan, just like Nancy Pelosi, the previous speaker. We know what happened last time around. There was tension. There was a strong response from the Chinese side because it's a sovereign issue. What do you think of the possibility of McCarthy, visiting Taiwan, and then, how China will respond?
Well, Kevin McCarthy's potential visit to Taiwan is not a matter of if, but a matter of when, in my view. He's going to visit sooner or later. I think the basic issue is that America's Taiwan policy has already changed. It has changed since the Trump administration. In the middle of the Trump administration, has been pretty much inherited by the Biden administration. Even though Washington keeps talking about sticking to one China policy, but the one China policy in Washington is totally different, in my view, from what Beijing's one China policy is. It's being watered down. It's being hollowed out. I give you one example. When Joe Biden talks about not supporting Taiwan independence, he was not talking about Taiwan independence as a process, but talking about Taiwan independence as a ceremony, I guess. One moment where I guess the government in Taiwan is going to declare independence. This is what he's talking about. And this is totally unacceptable to our side. I think the issue is that what's the only possible option that really the mainland side has to prevent Taiwan from going independence is really through military means. I'm not advocating for military actions towards Taiwan, but this is probably the only deterrent for, and I hope, thank goodness it's a deterrent to Taiwan's further growing independence. Kevin McCarthy says that Beijing has no say over where I can go, where I cannot go. And my response to him is that, yes, that's correct. But what PLA fighter jets can go or cannot go? And Kevin McCarthy has no oversight over that. So, I think, he has to realize that, and that, and I hope we don't go down that path. At the end of the day, I think, the peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait is an interest in both, three sides actually, Beijing, Washington, and Taipei as well. And I think people, given we've been talking about this war going on in Ukraine, and many edges have been made between Taiwan and Ukraine. I think one thing is for sure is that people in Taiwan are smart enough to realize that Ukraine example is not a path that are willing to go down. And they're smart enough to realize that. So I think, that's probably very good news for the future of Taiwan.
Mm-hmm. Briefly, the thing is like we have this one China principle for several decades, Harvey, and it worked pretty well, serving the interests of every sides of the U.S., the mainland and Taiwan. And we probably should continue with the one China principle and stick to what we promised to each other. And so peace and stability will be maintained in this region.
Hopefully that'll be the case. I'm very happy to see that the KMT opposition party is having consultations in China, because I think it bodes well for future relations, especially in view of the fact that the ruling party now, DPP, did so poorly in regional and urban elections a few months ago. So I'm hopeful that relations could get better in the near term, but America and people like McCarthy and people in his party are not going to help that. But the one China policy is what we've been living with for half a century, and we should continue that.
Mm-hmm. Let's hope that kind of relations will continue, and stability and peace will continue throughout the region and around the world. On that note, we conclude today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.